So I did an expansion on my shop, and now I have room to build a workbench where I can put my miter saw in and leave it there permanently. So in this video, I'm going to work on building that bench. And this might not be the best bench ever built. It might not be perfect, but I figured at least somebody might get some ideas or some thoughts on their design by watching how I build mine. So let's get started. So the first step of this process is the planning stage. It's very important that you really take some time to really think about not only where you're going to put this bench, but also some of the criteria that you need to look at and measurements for it to fit in there appropriately. So step one is going to be figuring out how to design your table to meet your needs. So in this step, I draw it out. I find I'm a visual person, so I will get a piece of paper and pencil and kind of sketch out a little bit to kind of figure out exactly how I want the layout to look. Not necessarily the measurements or how high up or how everything's setting up, but just get an idea of how I want it to look once it's done. Now, some of the things that you need to look at whenever you're designing this is the actual miter saw that you're going to be putting in this bench. So it's important for you to lay that miter saw out where you're wanting to put it. Make sure that you've got power close enough to reach it. And then also you need to measure the actual miter saw, the width of the miter saw, and how far back, if it's one that will actually allow you to cut larger pieces than just the straight cut. You can actually have some that are on slides. So you need to make sure that you account for that distance that slide needs to move. So another piece of that miter saw is also the movement. So you can cut a 45, cut it straight. And so that movement that you'll have on that miter saw, you need to account for that within your design, so that way you don't create the table and then not be able to move it all the way over to cut a 45-degree angle. So here's my miter saw that I'm going to get measurements off of and make sure that I have come up with the best layout and spacing for what I intend to use it for. So as you'll notice with mine, of course, I can go all the way from a 55 over to a straight 0-degree cut. And it's also on a slide. So since it is on a slide, that means I've got a little bit more movement. So this is kind of important because once you slide it all the way back, you've got to account for how far that slide goes back. If you just set it here where it's at the forward position and put your wall there, then you won't have any more room. So you got to make sure that when you set this in there and you lay your desk out, that you've got enough room to fit the entire saw in there. So for me, I measured it all the way back, all the way to where I want it, so that way I've got this movement, but the table is all the way out to the edge of it, so I can get the largest piece in here and I'll have support all the way back. So roughly I'm getting about 35 inches will give me plenty of room. The next thing I want to look at is, of course, how wide it is. So it's, we'll say 27¼ inches. But one thing that I mentioned earlier was how you have movement to cut it. So if I rotate this all the way to the farthest most extreme, you'll see that it extends out past that. So if I cut exactly that width, you're not going to be able to move it all the way in. So what I've done is I've got just a piece of wood, or you can use any straight edge that you have, and I move my arms out to account for that. And then I use that kind of straight edge so I can kind of get an idea if I have the wall where it's sitting down at that distance, what kind of room I've got. So I'm going to move it out so I've got plenty of room. So when I measure it out where I think that it'll fit the best, all the way on this side too. All right, I got plenty of room there. That it's about 35 inches. So that's the measurement I'll use for where my saw will sit, and the rest of the table will be flat across it. So you'll have that 35-inch span to give you room for your table saw's movement without binding up against the wall and making it so tight. Another measurement that we need to account for is how recessed that the miter saw needs to be in the workbench for it to be a straight level across from the workbench side across the miter saw. So what I've done is I've just gotten a known good straight edge and laid it across it. So now I've got it as a smooth surface. I would be hesitant to use a piece of wood because it might bow or crown, and it might give you a little bit off of a measurement. So once I've got that known good straight edge in there, then I'll measure from the bottom of it up to the bottom of the known straight edge, and I have 3.5 inches. So that lets me know that I need to have a 3.5 inch recessed shelf for this to set in, so that way the rest of the shelf will be smooth up against the rest of the miter saw table for me to be able to slide the wood nice and smoothly. So that's another measurement that we need to account for as we're doing our planning. So now I've got the miter saw kind of laid out where I want it in the shop. This will kind of assist me in deciding how far away from the wall that I want the table to extend. So once I get it laid out and I measure it, I come up with that I want from the wall about 3 feet. And so I'm going to use the existing studs that are in the wall to help support it. So I'm going to account for that as well. So I'm going to measure from the back wall out to as far as I want the table to go. And with that measurement, I came up with 3 foot 2 inches. All right, now that we've got our planning phase and our design phase complete, and we've got a good idea of how we're going to set this up. We've got some measurements to define how high everything is going to be, how wide we need for the table saw. Now it's time to start kind of putting that together and building it. So now this is when the fun begins. Okay, now I've started putting this together. Let's look at some measurements that we've done so far. So from the wall, as you can see, I went all the way and used the existing stud to support it. And I've come out and I'm 3 foot and 2 inches all the way out. So my actual surface of my table will be just under 3 foot. So I think that will give me plenty of room and not make it so far that whenever I want to reach something that I'm not going to be able to reach it. So some of those considerations need to be considered as well. If you make it too wide, then you're not gonna be able to reach in the back to pick your tools up and stuff that fall back there. So I think that 3 foot, around 3 foot, will give me plenty of room for a surface area, and also to give me enough room that I can reach without straining. So this is the area that I'm going to set up to have my actual miter saw placed in. So like we talked about, 35 inches. So I've got, 35 inches is how wide I have made this for my opening for it to set in there. So 35 inches in the front and the back, everything's square. Okay, so we've got the top built for this side. I put a few supports in to give it a little more stability. Put a piece on the ending wall to support the end of the plywood. So then what I did is I got a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, 3/4 inch plywood, 3/4. So it's, you know, fairly thick, very sturdy by itself, and cut it to the width that I needed. So it's from the end of the stud out to as far as you want it to be flush with that outside. And then I cut it the length that I needed to stop right there at the ending stud. Now that I've done this, I did run into a small issue with the depth that I needed to make for my saw was right on the line. So it didn't give me any room for having it lower to slide up underneath it. So it made it a little tighter than what I expected. Another thing that I ran into is that I would probably, if I did this again, put this stud on the other side. So that way I didn't have to build out. So I had to build out a stud to give it something for me to screw this into. If I would have put it on the other side, I probably wouldn't have had that issue. So lesson learned. That's what these videos are for, to kind of show you things for you to think about. So then I came in and I built the framing for where the actual miter saw is going to sit. I used 2x6s. You know, a lot of this is just scrap wood that I had left over from my expansion. So price of wood's so expensive right now, so I'm trying to save where I can. But it works out good to have these 2x6s, give it a good sturdy side base for it. Screwed those in, and then put a couple of supports in the middle to support the weight of the miter saw. If you don't put any supports in there, of course, even at 3/4 inch plywood, it's going to sag. So with that in there, it shouldn't be an issue. So then I cut my plywood. You can do it in one piece. I did multiple pieces because I had some scraps. 3/4 inch. Setting that in there. And then I can screw that down and then put my miter saw right on top, and then I'll screw it down to this. Of course, I'll screw the plywood. All the plywood is going to get screwed into all the supports to keep it from shifting, give it a little more rigidity, but that will give me my base. I've measured my height, exactly 3.5 inches, just like I measured for my height. So when I put my miter saw in there, it should be level across. I'll work on the next side, building that out next, and that's another day to start working that side, but I've at least gotten this side to a point to where I could put my miter saw on. So I'm going to go ahead and screw the top down and work on the other side tomorrow. All right, so now we're going to start working on the other side of our bench. Now, whenever I did the first side and set everything up and got the level where I connected to the stud, I didn't really explain all that because I got the level using a laser level. Not everybody has a laser level. If you do, great, you know how to use it. It makes it really simple. So what I'm going to do for this side is I'm going to show you just doing it with a straight edge or a level to make sure that you get your distance across. So we talked about being 3 foot up. So that's where I want to do, is make it 3 foot across. Now you could get a tape measure from the floor, measure it up, mark it at 3 foot, but is your floor level? Don't know. So the way I like to do it is I start at one point, decide where I'm going to have it located at, and then I'll use that as a reference as I go across. If I'm using my laser level, where that laser level is at is my reference for the height that I want it at. But if I'm doing it this way, then I'm just going to make sure that I am level with a leveler. So I can use my bubble to make sure I'm level. So for this, I'm going to come off of the existing side that I've already have set up for my reference to mark where I need to be on the stud to be the same height as the rest of them. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to come up, coming off of both of those studs, and I can see it. And I got my level, and I see I've got a good level on my level. And then I come over here and I mark it. So now that I've got it marked, I know how high I need it to be. So I can use that as my reference for attaching my board. So usually what I'll do is I'll just set the board up there. I'll screw one screw in, get the other side out. I'll get my level, and then once it's up, check it and make sure I'm level this way before I screw it into my 3 foot leg. That way I know I'm level this way and I'm level that way. And I can still do a little bit jiggling if I need to before I secure that in with both or 3 screws is what I'm doing for the final. Okay, I've got the rest of the bench frame built now. So just like we had started off with marking our lines, it's where I built out, got everything level. Still got a good level across. Same thing with the last one. Got it level. Have it all supported. As you see, I've got my router setting in here. Everything kind of lined out. I built the platform for it. And like I planned on doing before I had to build it out, by tying it in and then just having the plywood come all the way out to the end to support it. And then I've got a couple of supports running in between it to keep it from sagging. So it worked out real good. I got a good flush surface coming into this. I'll have a piece of plywood I'll cut and put in there to have it continue. And that way I can use it for either cutting or using my router. I don't have it fixed, but one thing too, if you're gonna do this, is make sure that you have when you set this up, so that way this is back as far as it'll go to be flush with this. Because you don't want to have it too far deep to where you're trying to run, you're going to run into your fence on your miter saw. So it's easier to bring it forward if you need to, and then if you have to build this out with some 2x4s or what have you to give you a smooth surface to continue out, you can. But just keep that in mind if you decide to put a router table in the mix like I did. So now all I have left is I've got to cut out some plywood to fit between there, to fit to the end of the table, and then I'm going to cut some pieces to close this off. I'm going to try to make sure I close all this off, and I'm going to put some plywood across the back. I'm going to go get a full sheet of plywood, cut it long ways in half, so I've got 2 feet up, and I'm going to stretch it all the way across, so at least I have a 2 foot barrier to keep dust and everything from just hitting the wall and falling down and then making a mess behind everything. So I'm going to try to prevent some of that by having all this kind of closed off, so that way whenever I want to vacuum, I can vacuum it up and it all should be right here on the table or in this trough. And I'll extend my vacuum system all the way around so I can tie it into this as well once it's all said and done. So that's my next step, is cut the plywood, get all the pieces of plywood in place and attached, and then we should be good. Okay, we finished the project. So as we left off last time, we were screwing down the tops. So I've got all my tops screwed down. I've got my router in place. It's screwed down. I've checked my level. I'm completely flush across both surfaces. And I've put the 2-foot back wall to protect us from getting that dust behind the wall. So I've got that screwed in. I'll probably come back with like quarter round or something along like that to put along to kind of seal it a little bit better to help protect it, to keep from that dust from getting back there and getting trapped and causing more of a mess to have to clean up. That's the project. Hopefully this information might be helpful for somebody. Like I said, I learned a few things. There's a few mistakes that I've made that I would have changed on my previous or my next ones that I do. So hopefully you've got something from this, and if you do, put a comment down below and I would appreciate your support.